So, I want to talk to you about this incredible cookbook, The Gaza Kitchen. It's written by Laila El-Haddad, and she's an award-winning Palestinian activist, writer, historian, and it's co-written by Maggie Schmidt, who's another writer, researcher, and educator and social activist. The book is now in its third edition, and it's been updated with new recipes, pictures, and stories each time. The book is an ethnographic documentary of the Gaza Strip. The book was all the field work in the first edition is from 2010. And what it does really well is it uses food to tell the story of the larger situation in Gaza. There's a lot of, when you first think of Gaza, you think of shelling, you think of violence, you think of images you may have seen on the news. You don't necessarily think of everyday life. And what this does a really good job of is explaining how people are adapting to their situation, how they're continuing to provide for their families, and also how the larger food economy is being affected by the political situation in Gaza.
Yeah, and so what are some of the, I guess, ingredients that
Some of the main ingredients. So they talk about, this book is a collection of like Palestinian diaspora recipes, but primarily focused on Gazan Palestinian food. And the way Gazan Palestinian food differs a little bit is it's heavier on spice, heavier on dill as well,
love dill?
and very heavy on the garlic as well.
Hmm.
And like when you look at the book, any ingredient, any recipe is going to tell a story about the current circumstance. Like, for example, historically, a lot of Palestinian recipes and a lot of Gazan recipes use a ton of olive oil.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, during moments of conflict, Israeli soldiers and settlers have destroyed lots and lots and lots of Palestinian olive trees. So access to olive oil, and also Gaza is separate from the West Bank, so is separated from where the existing Palestinian olive trees are. And so it's very tough to get olive oil. So olive oil is now used more as a garnish or as a finishing oil. And what's used predominantly now is like soy, anything that can be provided by aid.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because most of the population of Gaza has been displaced, the population there is about 75 to 80% refugees.
Wow.
And of that refugee population, like about 80% is dependent on aid for food items in their regular diet, like flour, oil, things like that.
It's wild because I, again, refamiliarized myself. You look at a map from 1930 or whatever, Palestine's on the map. And then you kind of look at subsequent maps. And then all of a sudden now, I try to Google map Palestine, and guess what, bitch? It ain't there.
Yeah, you're going to get lots of different scenarios. You're going to get lots of different options. And like the territories have been changing. So Palestine, the first major displacement for modern Israel occurred in 1948. That's the first expelling of Palestinians from their homeland in order to create Israel. And then you have other redistrictings that have happened due to various accords. The borders keep changing, and then the rules for the borders keep changing. Right now, there's a literal wall that encases Gaza and encases the West Bank. And there's no individual sovereignty inside of it. Like, so Gaza and the West Bank are still heavily, heavily, heavily controlled by the Israeli government and the Israeli military. So that affects things like who can get fishing permits in the Mediterranean Sea, who can import and export what. So everything that goes in is heavily, heavily rationed too.
I remember you saying that a reporter or a journalist said that getting into the West Bank.
Getting into Gaza was tougher than getting into Pyongyang. Yes, I've also when I had COVID, one of my number one symptom of COVID was rage. I was very angry. And then after that, I became a little bit fixated on Israel and Palestinian politics. There had been, while I was sick, an incident inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is in the West Bank, but that catalyzed a deeper dive into all of this stuff. Yeah, it's heavily controlled, and it's a heavily controlled area, and this cookbook is a great way to the cookbook. I mean, it feels really shitty to say this is a great way to humanize a whole area, because these are humans beings.
Yeah. But I think I feel what you're saying, because like if somebody's out there and they're like, I want to know about this stuff, but I don't know a way, like this is a very, I think, efficient way of learning about Gazan culture, about Palestinian culture that isn't diasporic, that is right there, and how they make food. Because the thing is, like the dishes are, you look at the dish and you're like, wow, I hope I can make this. Looks very intricate. This looks very like any, it's like any other cuisine. It's beautiful, it's yummy, it looks comforting, it looks like comfort food, all the other things. And that is, I think, like, part of the reason why I know Chet has mentioned this before, food brings people together. It's a way of sharing. This is a really, I think, efficient and joyful way of learning about something that's really kind of tough.
Yeah, and a lot of people, and I personally, for a long time, I was like, oh, the situation with Israel and Palestine is really complicated. I don't know. And because of that, I've sort of stayed away from learning more about it, when it should have been, oh, this is really complicated, so let me start taking little pieces and try to understand what I can.
Yeah.
And also U.S. media does have a really strong Israeli bias, and so it can be kind of tough to know what's going on out there. So that's why I super recommend other news sources. Al Jazeera is a great source for news in the Middle East. And Laila El-Haddad, one of the authors of this cookbook, is a longtime correspondent and used to be a journalist for Al Jazeera, and contributes a lot to like BBC. So this is a very, very reputable source.
Yeah, and very I don't know. I just was really impressed. Like like, if you didn't know that she had a journalism background, it like the bios, or like the sort of anecdotal stories or whatever. I mean, I thought I was going to flip through it, maybe pick out some recipes that I wanted to make. I ended up spending maybe an hour on the couch, just like reading the stories. And I think sometimes
interviews and stories are so great. They're my favorite part of this cookbook.
Yeah,
it's so really full of really good profiles of different homemakers from all across different walks of Gazan life, like from more rural parts to more metropolitan parts. And they also do a good job of interviewing people across the whole food system: aid workers, shopkeepers, bakers, all sorts of things. It's a really, really cool document. There's another thing that the authors write about in one of the introductions, where they talk about like the pitfalls of like, they know that a cookbook isn't going to unite the Middle East.
Right.
And the phrase that they use in the cookbook is hummus kumbaya. Like, we're not going to all, it's not going to solve everything, but it is
hummus
a way
is good, though, man. I don't know.
But hummus is good, and but it is a way to understand people and to understand traditions, and this cookbook does a great job of putting together a lot of oral histories, because a lot of these towns, that some of the Gaza's got such a huge refugee population, so many people have been taken from their original homes. Sometimes these stories and recipes are the only thing that's left of that whole area. And that's why it's so important to preserve. Yeah.
It's an incredible, I mean, I really, if you're even remotely, even if you're like, I'm not going to cook, whatever, I don't like cooking, I just like hearing about food or whatever.
Like reading. I just like history.
It's such an important, I think right now too is such an important time. People are talking about it more. I recall a time growing up when people would never bring up Palestine at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a great way to start conversations, even if it is like I read this really cool. I have this cookbook, and there's this really cool profile on this guy who immigrated to America in Maryland, and he was talking about this funny story about olive oil or whatever, like from flying from Palestine to the States for the first time. It's just such a great. There's such a dynamic book.